The tolerance of breaking their oath of office to take convenient functions in systematic contracts with the devil or the enemy of the United States in order to advance their personal agendas and finances and conveniences, which is hyper accelerated. The more positions they claim, the more they become infected into the system, which then automates the function of having created the corruption itself. And thus, the action of the political violence only needs to be political violence until the Confederate policy is able to replace the American policy and normalize the function of the ritual corruption. And thus, the action then becomes institutionalized as illegal policy or customs without reason, which are disqualified and thus seek to legitimize themselves fraudulently by the advancement of making superior law less than inferior law and thus subordinate, and to be overtaken as inferior law is less relevant than customs without reason, which is the anarcho communist state of the Confederacy, as definitions are sticky, and thus the fact of the matter requires the anarchists to actively dissolve the meaning of words and thus actively undermine it by secrecy, and thus the criminalizing of evidence, and thus the criminalizing of investigation of their activities, systematically gaining ground against the system of checks and balances. Now, the system is not the function of the government investigating the government, as the act of checks and balances is a legitimate obligation. The problem is dereliction of duty in that function, as the tendency for the legislator to be overly lax on another branch or for the judiciary to be overly lax on the other branch becomes the functional status quo objective, normalizing the unitary executive theory of a singular king over an executive. And that king over the executive is less than his wizard council subordinates and thus superiors, and thus the action of the infinite powers of the king provided to the bureaucrats as a thing that had crushed the Chinese empire in the past, having generating the infinite variation of the acceleration of the aristocratic class, of the support structure and mechanisms of the perpetual judicial activities, creating the hyperpower towards those positions, which is what they're recreating, which has failed historically, and thus requires the function of the in depth research in the edits to finalize on the final draft in order to insert the full definition and breadth and context, which is currently being obstructed by the war criminals' illegal censorship campaigns in order to sell their illusion delusion, manifesting their artificial reality into reality and replacing the records by systemic defrauding of the records as to maintain their contempt for court until there are no more American judges in order to challenge them, nullifying the checks and balances, and thus the action of the government being able to investigate itself is systematically being targeted, which started most effectively in their War on David, targeting the key higher branches, which would have conducted the more essential aspects of checks and balances, and then moving from the higher diverse mechanisms to the lesser issues, and thus the action of allowing it to just kind of sink into itself once the higher mechanism, once the stronger mechanism has dissolved. Thus, the activity of the changes being consistently exchanged on the basis of their very strategy needs to receive the full due diligence and then insert it into the videos. But the act itself generates the obligation to, ugh, that's retarded. But Basically, it's corruption of the system by their political violence. Thus, the act of the political violence is not the long-standing objective, as that is a high-cost, high-risk function. Once it's normalized into the corruption and replacement of the system with the Confederate exchange of the anti-American enemy of the Constitution norm, generates the position in perpetuity of the self-generated corruption, similar to their overtaking of the prison system, generating abuse as a status quo norm, which then manufactures the pipeline of the domestic abusers who, having been subjugated to the change of alignment by virtue of the ritual activities of being subject to the subhuman conditions, allows them to be dissolved, and thus the action of having changed them by Frazubulu's deceptive activities, engaging in the traps which normalize the function of drowning the participants into the Ooze, of Frazubulu's partner in crime, Juiblex, completes the function of the normal transformation, and thus the impersonators who have replaced the person who had entered there is then perpetuity is generated in perpetuity as a fake person replacing the original person, as they are no longer functionally the same person, and thus the mimic from the slime engages in the activity of normalizing the function as they have matured according to the ritual practices, including but not limited to the pursuit of conducting higher legal good functions, and thus the action of it being a more attractive victim of the demonic, and thus the action of the conversion being more fundamental to their existence, persistently applies the pressure until they cave into each systematic trap by the mechanism of having normalized it by the system itself, which is no longer functioning as an American activity or service of law or official act, but rather its replacement, pseudo intellectual, deformed variant of actions for the wizards against the system, and thus the argument for each of the departments becomes to support their oath of office, and thus the function of supporting their office, or to support the department, which is in contrary function to the use of the office, and thus the action of these conflicts by the insurgency engaging in these subtle conflicts, asserting domination over each branch, facilitates the status quo conflict to destroy the structure by the demon lords in their military campaign for the Confederacy against the human society. Now, this includes the standard function of the KKK contracts for the surveillance hate group activities to normalize the function of hate groups activities such as the social violence, actively recorrecting and transforming society into their desired shape as they purge everyone who's not the right type of white and thus genetically guilty. And thus, the activity of these purges, which is actively amorphous, generates the function of these persistent obligations of the victims who have to engage in the function of certain shapes of structure, but the activity of the shapes of structure amongst the amorphous ooze is non-reliable, and thus the active delay derivative of having to slug through the swampish sewage normalizes the activity of its higher difficulty levels, as too many inconveniences have to be generated as a military strategy until the society is demoralized and fully broken and willfully ceases to exist and collapses into the wizard communists, and thus, having sold it to America's enemies, would then be redistributed by those who have purchased the right of conquest, with the wizard communists engaging in the normal dissection of each of these functions, as the civilian demoralized population, having been traumatized into a dazed state, is then sold into its various forms of slavery and captivity, and thus the function continues until the radicalization of the white supremacists engaged in the purging at the international level, at which point they will then start their wars and engage in their larger contests to destroy the rivals, which most likely will start with those nations which had purchased the right of conquest of the Americans as a false justification of retaliation to what they wanted to do while everything was fine. And thus the action of the social violence, as an example, maintains the position of holding someone exponentially too long in order for the specific thing that they would be doing to time out, and thus the activity of the benefit of its access, such as the right of networking and associations, is then collapsed, and thus the obligation of the remedy fundamentally is disconnected from the function of experience, as the social violence had corralled them away from the activity in favor of the rape culture, so that the dissemination of the support of the hate crimes having been paid in the rapes would be able to continue the support of that system until there is nothing left, and thus the action continues until the revolution by the white supremacist communists has matured and turns on its radicals, who will then themselves be drowned in the ooze which they had so maliciously destroyed their betters with. Now, the act of kiting in order to make adversaries fight each other instead of the primary is a superior perfected strategy by Frau Zobel, who, having impaled many a foe upon other foes, have actively incorporated the Pale Knight, as well as Loth and many others, in order to maximum effectiveness against the system, as the ingestion of the portals from the demonic actively increase the fluctuation of the torrents of the demonic energies into the system, as each demon lord asserts themselves according to the purchase of the right of conquest, having accelerated their own particular interest, knowing in the future that their anarchical agreement cannot stand for a long period of time, but for the moment it is everlasting and convenient until further notice of the next dawn. But that requires all of the preparations to be set up ahead of time, or the portals would not actively increase in the redirection of the currents, and thus would not initiate those primary threats currently on the warpath. Now, the act of the delays exponentially happening well beyond the expiration point makes it inconvenient for the legal remedy to take place, as the experiences, having exponentially separated themselves, become complicated, as the normalization of various complications, such as the dating rituals, engages in a more amorphous arbitrary argument as the function of dating as a sub-portion of the existence of the normal arbitrary sales, as opposed to long-term contracts, has to happen before the long-term contracts, and thus the lower commitment has to be settled, which is more minutely difficult to estimate, and thus the action requires larger, less maneuverable strategies. And to this extent, the mechanism of those less maneuverable strategies become the acceptance as the defect, as an alternative rape culture, and thus the action of going from one rape culture to another rape culture to another rape culture is the fighting retreat strategy, which can only be countered by the cooperation of all parties into the logical position in order to have manifested the neutralization of its effectiveness by cooperating into the logical arguments for structured society. And these types of complications might include the function of where primary investments would have to have taken place, certifying schedules, certifying locations for each particular party, what the activity is, what their status is, what their availability is, and so on. And thus the action becomes complicated. But then the function of their non-criminal actions, such as the function of engaging in posturing, gossip, and others, engages in minor conflicts short of direct criminal action, and thus the action of their before criminal action procedure of the communist tactic of I'm not touching you, as is promoted by James Lindsay, which should be inserted into the videos, generates the position such as their need for the school campuses from Don Bull Sr. to not be in certain places for certain investments, and thus the action of making them in another location, which they have sold at a larger bit and then pre-sell smaller black market contracts, such as the normalization, as locations for dating options, that type of arrangement, which is actively a thing that has to be considered and would be considered, especially by the rapist, and thus the action of actively moving them and generating these postures includes, but is not limited, the fights over fence locations, and thus the action of territory, and thus the action of the engage in a poker contest where you're trying to invest into the pot to make the other person invest into the pot, so that the person has to either fold and give up on everything or to push and try and claim it all. And thus the action of getting them to push in order to claim it all actively traps them into putting the money into those particular locations, hyper accelerating the investment into those locations in order to engage in the cementing of the roots which they would otherwise seek to destroy, and thus the qualifier of all of the other options by virtue of the existence of that structure, and thus the action of them forfeiting that position if they could destroy the roots then becomes an active subversion of the thing, and thus the action of not fighting for the original roots in the original manner to have been justified certifies the acknowledgement of their knowledge in the criminal market as a criminal activity, and thus the nullification of any partnerships that they would have gained as an advantage, as their entire relationship in the network is fully illusionary as an insurgent, as is expressed by their non-commitment, such as, but is not limited to, the uh, position in Solomon when there are two women were fighting over an infant, and he said to cut it in half, and one said yes, and the other said give it to the other one as long as it lives. These types of things have to be done in order to assert the position of original intention, and thus the assertion of criminal activity and the financial corrections normally asserted to that activity, as the function of the states of hate groups having the control asserts the perpetual harassment and thus the perpetual rape culture, and thus the states of emergency perpetrating the activities necessary for any type of relationship which cannot by definition have a contract obligation, as the function of marriage, which would be a forgery under the rape culture, as the function of the rape would nullify by the forgery the activity of having normalized that relationship, making it at worst a completely nullified criminal rape, and at best the absolute highest thing that you could possibly hope for is that there's just an advanced form of dating which does not qualify as any certified long-term obligation, unless the activity, having been made this amorphous, difficult thing, becomes again a normal strategy of traumatizing the public into conceding and forfeiting its right to exist and to be replaced by its hated adversary. Again, the numbers should be imported, and properties and blueprints and the rest of it should be imported for the particular videos in order to express them in a progressively refined manner from general to specific until you know the logical answer on how to pursue on any of the particular interests, which would then normalize. And the more professional everyone acts, the easier it is for that to transfer. And thus, the vulnerable state highly encourages the inconvenience of anyone who would posture for advantages not otherwise available. And thus, bad faith is going to come into it, and thus the need for the higher structures for the reorganizing back into a free society and all of its prerequisites. Now, the zombie insurance has many of the solutions for this, but is redacted and is likely to have been replaced and edited with many of the subversive techniques by the Confederates, and thus fundamentally would have to be reconstructed, and thus the asking of the question requires the existence of the system, which requires the investment in the restoration of the faculties, which delays the process exponentially, which by definition is the primary frustration with these war tactics, as the mechanisms of the damages of war is designed to frustrate the existence of normal functioning society. As Americans or otherwise law-abiding citizens around the world, you are the enemy to these terrorists, unless the action is infinitely to be understood as a war crime against the unarmed civilian population. And to this extent, the mechanism of arresting them for the full activities that they've been participating in, the stacking offenses, must be calculated in its full due diligence, requires the action of Congress to force the duel for the releasing of David's faculties, which would then re-engage in the function, which is the necessary function in order to engage in those calculations, which, if you want to end the rape culture, you will by definition have to have done, and any alternative is a cheap imitation which will fail immediately, or cave into the function of the alternative rape culture, progressing it in its evolved state, solving nothing. The worship of Lolth and the mechanism of the Pale Knight actively encourages the influx from these rights to war campaigns, which maintains the active position, such as from the Pale Knight, which, as a key aspect of the female Gnosticism, actively has the capacity of possession as a form of ghost functions, and thus the activity of actively running someone ragged and thus engaging in the full duplicitous pleasures of their life underneath that control actively engages in the destruction of that life by systemically hyper energetic um, exhaustions, and thus the action perpetrates to itself the function of the hypersexualized women in the dating market, which then being used by the possession would be actively leveraged for advanced porn, and thus the action by the surveillance function of the surveillance agent being able to live their life through their victims being trafficked actively accelerates their position, and thus the function of having taken over the more attractive becomes functionally more desirable to this extent, and thus the feat happening en masse engages in the more control for the hyper control of the system, which then normalizes the rape culture, which has traumatized the central pieces. So, like for instance, if you want to destroy a part of the market, you attack the higher stabilizing functions, the higher pieces, the higher companies, and thus the actively targeting the more attractive, and thus the action of seizing the higher sexual market value, and thus the changing of the fundamental sexual market, and thus the redirecting of the entire system, such as the use of claiming control over particular parties, and thus the extension from their various malicious Subversions from their demonic campaigns engages in that activity, such as the capture of victims' sexuality that aren't directly the possessed party, who then, being corralled as animals, actively have their options cut off strategically as a perpetual harassment technique, as the perpetual following of that person and crafting of their social engagements and thus their social options inevitably engages in the function of normalizing the contracts from the rape culture to be able to not have challengers. And the act of having collapsed the larger structures allows for the reforming of the social ism from the charism, and thus the charisma-based socialism allows for that restructured society under the hate group's systemic social violence. This, in combination with the Lolth activities of actively engaging in subterfuge and subversions by the female Gnosticists engaging in the witchcraft, actively manipulates these functions to the express purpose of chaos for the sake of collapsing, and the party engaging in this dominatrix like function uh, systematically promotes the function of individuals' fake discipline, which asserts themselves in higher potential until they actually have to get something from the center of attention, which then would be gifted to them with the utter disdain for having to have had to have been helped in this arrangement, engaging in the consistent cycling and recycling of the society and its various structured systems. Crimes and offenses are punished harshly and without forgiveness and without mercy, but actively praises the function of getting away with the scam, and thus the action engages in the perpetuity of chaos for the entertainment of the female Gnosticists. And these queens of the mean girl system actively distribute their malice into a perfected art. The activity of cooperation with these restorations includes the violations which would have actively been situated from the traps generated by the Confederates, where people systematically dissolve themselves in the deals with the devils while joining to the Confederates, and thus the function of being a captured form where they are intentionally being guilty as the function of having studied the legal procedures of the United States would have led them to a position where they would have been assessed as guilty of the thing without it being disqualified. Under this position, from their systematic struggling sessions and other subversions, have engaged in many who are threatened with the consequences of the Americans taking over the United States and throwing out the Confederates, as they having the fear that they would be sentenced to the Confederacy to suffer for their crimes against humanity, is a real and vital thing, and thus the function of the structured order in its reconstruction would primarily rely on them as cooperating with the government in the destruction of enemies of the United States in order to defend, uphold, and support the United States Constitution is necessary to national security. And to this extent, those engaged in those functions, escaping by virtue of these actions, would be stuck in a position of contract schedules in order to sustain themselves against the debts just before being collapsed into the hellscape that is the social dilemma machine known as the Confederacy, and thus the state of anarchical terrorism by the sustaining hate groups becomes the function of absolute horrors. Now, if the Americans don't do anything to them whatsoever, the existence of their society is itself its own punishment. Thus, the fact that if you let them take over the United States, you have the same functioning dilemma. There is no mechanism that is primarily different about it. The realization of the calculations compounding the traumas of them is a demonstration of inevitability, and thus the action of accelerant is not really an accelerant as they are already liable, and thus the action of fully disconnecting themselves from it in its consequences by an automated structure would still inevitably create the system of anarchy, which would inevitably create the system of generating those liabilities, which would then get them to where they would be looking at either way. And thus, when snowboarding, you go where you're facing. When you're doing anything technical, you go where you're headed. Your momentum goes wherever you're facing, and thus the action of where you know you deserve to be is where you head, and thus they, as a collective society facing that direction, will always head in the same direction themselves. They will always go to their core loyalties of insanity, to poverty. They are, have been, and will always be the entire definition of white trash as a social obligation.